I'm like, but I can't really remember. He goes, well, can I listen in? So he's here. That's why I'm in the living room. So he,
Oh,
that's the only time this has ever happened in my entire career.
good Lord.
So that's a little pressure.
That's a
You
little
got,
pressure, just a little pressure.
you got to
Steve,
beat Netflix.
Steve, you want to give a little intro for yourself, or
Sure.
and we can get started?
So I'm Steve Dykstra. I'm a psychologist from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, really Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, where Mary Newton and I get into trouble doing things. I first first ring suburb of Milwaukee. I work for Milwaukee County. My regular gig is mental health, deep end mental health stuff for kids, trauma, um, very severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and stuff like that. Um, and through that work, I came to be involved in all this reading stuff because so many of the kids I work with, basically all the kids I work, virtually all the kids I work with are poor. Um, and they suffer greatly when they can't read. It's not good when more privileged kids can't read. It's catastrophic when underprivileged kids can't read. And they suffer more and they're more likely to have these challenges. And their school districts are more likely to be underfunded and overwhelmed, so they're less able to respond. So that got me involved in it. That and people on the other side pissed me off. And so I just kind of I sort of got after them at some point and I can't stop. So that's where we are. And today, let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. So this is this is the presentation for tonight, what we can learn from other professions, but what to do when the science runs out, because the science always runs out. There's always a next question beyond it. There's always something else we want to know that we won't have a firm scientific answer for. And in fact, teaching kids how to read, which I've never done, teaching kids how to read and meeting these challenges is about the same in some ways. We have a little more science than some professions have. We have less science than other professions have. But what got me to do this was the recognition that people don't seem, what was obvious to me might not be obvious to everybody who teaches reading, and that is the science runs out. It runs out in a lot of fields. It runs out in a lot of professions. And if we look at the way they handle it, professions where there isn't so much misinformation and acrimony sometimes, we can see more clearly how they handle it. And they handle it in some good ways, and we can learn from that. And I think it'll help us to feel better about what we do and what we don't do, what we know and what we don't know, than if we stayed kind of in our own little bubble. So let's get started. So we have some very good science about how brains read. And, this is a good moment to say, to remind ourselves that, it isn't their spleen that's reading. It isn't their liver. It isn't their lungs. Hearts are great, but they don't read. Brains read. And what we know about how brains read, we have some very, very good science about how brains read, how they do it. The science is robust and answers a number of very important questions. The science has been robust for a while, but it's become much more robust lately. And a lot of that has to do with the technology of fMRI and better use of computers to analyze evoked potentials, EEGs. So we know more about what brains are doing than we used to. The brain used to be a little bit of a black box. Things happened to it. We put things in and the brain changed and suddenly brains could read, and we sort of stood back and said, wow, that's pretty amazing. I wonder how that happened. Now we can watch brains read. We can measure things when brains read. We understand a lot more about that than we used to. We used to know from the 60s forward that one way of teaching seemed to be better than another way of teaching, but we weren't sure why that was. And when you add the brain research to it, we have a much clearer idea of what goes on. One of my favorite truths about this is before we had fMRI, Mark Seidenberg and other people who did computer modeling of reading said there should be these kinds of nodes in your brain that do things, 4 of them. And sure enough, that's what we find. And that's an interesting thing, that the number of processors in the brain lined up with what his computer models predicted. But that science is not complete. The science of a lot of things is incomplete. The things you hold to be, that you believe are other fields that you may think have all their answers nailed down by science, they don't have all their answers nailed by science. We have people on this call we have somebody on this call who's a pediatrician. They try to follow science, but following science and the actual application of science to human beings is a messy thing. And we don't have all the answers we'd like to have all the time. And we're getting more answers every day. We're getting more answers all the time. And getting those answers to people who are teaching and doing it in a way that it's useful to them rather than just sending them some sort of news blast about what the science says is more challenging, I think, than people sometimes realize. We have some science about how to teach reading specifically, as well as science about how brains learn generally. So we have some science specifically about how to teach reading. Then we have a more broad general body of science about how brains learn best, principles of teaching that seem to be supported by science, some of which are more traditional, some of which are more scientific, and how do we apply those to reading? And this science as well is very incomplete. That's something I come back to repeatedly in this presentation. The science is incomplete. Now, that gets to be a problem when you go by the moniker of the science of reading, because the implication is that what we're doing is supported by science. It's more supported by science than what other people have done, what some other people are doing at the same time. So the challenge of that is, if you don't understand the science carefully enough, you can believe some things are supported by the science or even are mandated or required by the science that really aren't. And one of the things I want to encourage proponents for the science of reading to do is to have a clear idea in their mind and constantly test this idea that says, this is the science, and this is what I make of the science. Those are not the same thing. And even if the science hasn't changed, my best interpretation of what to do with that science might change. Our best practices for teaching brains to read include approaches with very good scientific support, as well as our best guess at how to translate the science we have into practice based on our experience, philosophy, and understanding of the science. And I'll give you some really clear examples of that, and then talk about how we deal with that in other professions, all professions which provide therapy, treatment, instruction, service to human beings, including very young, small human beings, because that's very challenging. It is critical that we understand the difference between what the science mandates and our best effort to translate that mandate into practice. For instance, we can be very confident that the science directs us to focus on letters and sounds, The science is very clear that that's a better way to learn reading than to neglect the teaching about letters and sounds, the relationship from letters to sounds. That is rock solid science. It's very unlikely to change. How we implement that, how we teach letters and sounds, what letters do we teach first? How many of the sounds do we teach? What pace do we go at? What methods do we use? As we're helping kids recognize and manipulate sounds and we're teaching them letters, at what point do we connect the letters to the sounds? How do we do that? How do we recognize that it's going well? How do we recognize that the child may be struggling? How do we respond when a child struggles? Some of those answers are more science than others. And some of those questions, some of the answers to those questions are further from the center of science. One of the debates we have, and I'm going to use the name of a very well-known reading scientist from Wisconsin, who's also a friend of mine, Mark Seidenberg, and other people in the reading science world would like us to know that not everything in the science of reading is science, that we're sometimes calling things science or keeping things under the banner of science or under within the label of science, that if you looked at them closely, they're not really science. That's probably true if we say science, the scientific approach is only includes those things which are very solidly known, which are very unlikely to change, which are supported by multiple strands of science that have very good data and very good replication. those things are science, nothing else is. You can say that, but in everyday practice, we cannot allow ourselves to be limited just to those things, because there's not enough things that are confirmed through that level of science to fill a 90-minute reading block and to respond to every kid's needs, starting in kindergarten up through the point that every child hopefully is a proficient reader. It is critical that we recognize the difference between what science mandates and our best effort to translate that mandate into practice. Science clearly mandates that we teach letters and sounds and the relationship between letters and sounds. We all know the names for those things. It very clearly mandates that. It is much less clear about how we carry that out. And it may be even less clear about what to do when it starts to fail, and what's our plan B, what's our plan C, what's our plan D. So let's take the example of phoneme awareness. Very robust science tells us that phoneme awareness is critical to the ability to read. The science is extremely unlikely to be disproved at any point in the future. Phoneme awareness is clearly related to reading success. We do not find skilled readers who completely lack phoneme awareness. There are no skilled readers with really for whom reading comes easily, who are completely absent of phoneme awareness. And we know that kids who start out in life with good phoneme awareness and who find phoneme awareness easy to obtain, phoneme awareness comes easily to them, those kids as a group learn to read much better than kids who don't, who struggle with phoneme awareness. When I was a graduate student at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, Illinois, go Salukis, one of my professors down there, I didn't do a lot with him, but one of those professors down there was a guy named Dennis Mulfeast. Dennis left us and eventually went to Louisville and eventually found his way to Nebraska. Dennis did, he's retired now, he's professor emeritus at least at the University of Nebraska. Dennis did some brilliant work. He put electrodes on the heads, first of graduate students like me. I was literally pulled into a lab in the evening in the department. I was kind of shanghaied out in the hallway, and they put me in a chair and talked nice to me while they taped electrodes onto my head. It's no kidding. It was like 7:30 at night, and I'm like, "What are you doing?" "We need one more." And they taped these electrodes to my head, and they played sounds through headphones into my ears. Phonemes, I would find out later, phonemes that do not occur in English and that come from obscure languages that I likely never heard in my life. So that my brain had very little experience with these sounds. I was like an infant hearing English for the first time. And what they did was they watched the evoked potentials in my brain. They played the sounds. Then they played other things. Then they came back to the sounds they played earlier and added some new sounds they had not played earlier, and watched my brain react to the sounds I had learned a few minutes ago and the ones that I was only hearing for the first time now, to see, could they see the differences? Could they see the differences? Using a much more advanced form of that, Mulfeast and the scientists in his lab are able to put a net of electrodes on a baby's head. It's much easier than it used to be. There's no tape. They just put them on their head. They don't place them as percent. And using a computer to analyze the results, they can recognize brains which are destined to read easily and brains that are destined to struggle with reading in children as young as just a couple of weeks old. And that ability to distinguish sounds, to learn sounds, to hear a sound and know right away, I've heard that before, that's familiar to me. I can hear the difference between that and another sound. Brains that are good at that find learning to read much easier than brains that struggle with that. Science tells us some about how best to teach phoneme awareness, but does not tell us everything we want to know. It does not tell us everything, but it tells us some. And we fill in the gaps with our best judgment, rooted in the science, hopefully, to develop instructional practice and respond to the needs of both classrooms and individuals. Over the last number of years, one of the great debates in the field, in the area around phoneme awareness, Maria's with us, she knows this, I know this, many of you know this. One of the great debates is, how soon should we connect letters to phonemes as we're teaching phoneme awareness? How soon should we do that? Do we need a period of teaching phoneme awareness before that, where we're teaching the phonemes so-called in the dark or blind? How should we respond if we start teaching letters and sounds immediately in the beginning, connecting them using letters to represent those sounds? We're going to do that at some point. If we do that right from the beginning and a child struggles to read, struggles to get it, do we keep doing it that way, or do we back out and start teaching them in the dark again? Do we separate the sounds and the letters, or do we just stay with the sounds and the letters together? There's great debate on that. The trend, I think, clearly is moving towards connecting letters to sounds earlier than maybe some people were interested in doing that. And one of the things I think we have to understand about this, and this is an example, the fact that there are studies out there which very carefully kept phonics, letter sound correspondences, and phoneme awareness separate during the study. They may have kept them separate, worked very hard at keeping them separate, was necessary at one point in the science to document that phoneme awareness has its own value, makes its own contribution to reading and learning to read, separate from letters, separate from phonics, rules, and letters. That doesn't mean we have to disconnect them when we teach, but it also doesn't mean that connecting them right from the beginning and always keeping them connected and never disconnecting them is the best thing for teaching, or more importantly, is the best thing for everybody who's learning to read. So we fill in the gaps with our best judgment, rooted in the science, to develop instructional practice and respond to the needs of both classrooms and individuals. I think that's something to keep in mind too, is that unlike most professions which attempt to provide therapy or service to human beings, teaching by necessity is providing it in groups. I mean, there is such a thing as group therapy, but I don't do it. When I evaluate a kid, I evaluate a kid one at a time. When I do therapy with a kid, I do it one at a time. Well, there may have been vaccine clinics where we vaccinated a bunch of kids all in one time. Professor Brenda Warren, who's has been a pediatrician at some point in her life, I don't think she did exams on 50 kids at one time. We're working on a one-to-one basis, whereas in education, we're working both one-to-one and with a group, and the group can be very, very diverse, and that presents challenges as well to how we do that. What the science may tell us about how to provide instruction to this one child who's sitting in front of us now may not be as easily applied when you're standing in front of a room with 25 kids. That's an entirely different challenge, and one which is, in terms of how often it comes up, is pretty unique to teaching children. I'm going to ask one of my co-hosts to check. There's something in the chat, and if that's something important, let me know. Our most common mistakes: confusing our best judgment with the science we rely on. We see this all the time. You know, one of the places it comes up, if you're ever in these places online, one of the places it comes up, and I joke with people about this, I will not get involved in the debate over whether we should teach the names of letters before the sounds of letters before the names. Because if you get in the wrong room online and you take the wrong position on that, I'm convinced people will hire assassins to come to my house and kill me and my entire family because they're so passionate about it. And the thing that gets me about it is the people who say you should absolutely teach the sounds, not the names of the letters. And the people who say you should absolutely teach the names of the letters, not doing that is ridiculous. They are both absolutely convinced that the science mandates that you do it that way. That if you're not doing it that way, you're not following the science. There is very good reasoning on this. Marilyn Adams has weighed in on it, I think, very persuasively. I tend to side with Marilyn on that things have names. Kids are used to things having names, and teaching the names of things is not a problem. But even Marilyn Adams, with all her weight and power and influence within the world of reading, is hesitant to talk about it because it gets people so stirred up. The fact of the matter is there is not absolutely conclusive science to tell us to do it one way or the other. And there are kids who have learned to read very successfully, being taught one way. very successfully being taught the other way, and there's no clear evidence that either one of those is significantly better than the other one. But if you say that in the wrong place, people are convinced, they are absolutely convinced that the science mandates one or the other. And if you're not doing it that way, you're not teaching the science of reading. I think we see the same thing when people get into a debate over what order to teach letters in, what order should we teach sounds. There's some very, very good reasoning about the order to teach the sounds, and many people on this call know more about that than me. I listen to those reasons. They make a lot of sense to me. They seem logical. They seem reasonable. They seem based in good thinking. But that doesn't mean that the science mandates them. That does not mean that there is hard science to say teaching the letters in this order or teaching the letters and sounds in this order leads to significantly different results 2, 3, 4 years into the future in terms of how well kids read. The science clearly tells us to pay close attention to phoneme awareness and to teach it. It strongly suggests that we teach it explicitly. Let me say something about that. Just because we say we should teach everything explicitly, I think everything we teach about these skills should be taught very explicitly, doesn't mean that kids will not intuit or use what they know about language to figure some other things out on their own that we have not yet taught explicitly. And thank God they do. If everything kids learned about language had to be explicitly taught, if there was no inferencing going on, if there was no, if the kids were not figuring any of this out on their own from their prior experience, there's not enough days, weeks, months, years, and hours in their educational life to teach them everything they're going to know. Now, that saying that that kind of learning is important, inferential learning is important, doesn't mean that that's our plan for them learning. It doesn't mean we aren't ready to teach everything that needs to be taught. It just means that some of that is always going to go on. Just because we're prepared to teach everything explicitly doesn't mean that some kids won't figure some of these things out from their prior knowledge and experience with language. It says much less about the details about how we teach it. It clearly does not say every child needs to be explicitly taught to recognize, produce, blend, and segment every English phoneme precisely the way you teach it on the schedule you follow. I see these debates online between people saying, do I teach this sound before this sound? How long do I teach it? How do I know it? And people coming back with really passionate opinions. No, don't do it that way. You have to do it in this order. And I feel bad for them. Sometimes I join in and try to calm people down. And sometimes I'm much more cautious than that. Depends on how excited people are and whether I think they can figure out where I live and send a hitman to my house. Your best effort to implement the science is not the science. Let me say that again. Your best effort to implement the science is not the science. We have to be very willing to change how we understand the science and how we implement the science, and not hang on to our favorite ways of doing it. The way we should hang on to the science properly itself. On the other hand, scientists who have revealed what we know about reading, how it works, how brains do it, and how we should teach it, cannot demand that teachers limit their practice to only those methods and programs which have direct scientific evidence of effectiveness. They can't do that because even something that's shown to be better than all other known methods isn't necessarily going to solve reading for every kid. If you're working with a child, teaching phoneme awareness, for example, because that's the example we're using, teaching phoneme awareness in the ways that have the best scientific support, and the kid's not getting it, there are scientists who want you to know you should just keep doing the same thing, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it till the kid catches on. That's irrational. At some point, you have to try something else. You have to try the second choice and the third choice and the fourth choice, because that child isn't getting it from what you're doing now. It's not enough. You have to be willing to try something else. And scientists who would say, no, you shouldn't try anything that has less scientific support than this other method, don't understand the challenge of what you're trying to do. They can demand that we begin there, but not that we end there. They can demand that we begin there, but not that we end there. You could have a medical condition for which one medicine is clearly the best choice, and best practice would demand that in treating that condition, you always begin with that medication. But if that medication is ineffective, or the person is in the small group of people who do not respond well to it, or do not respond adequately to it, you may then be required by a standard of care to start considering other medicines which might help this person to achieve better results. You start with the thing that's the best, but you're ready to try something else if you need to. There aren't enough programs and methods with that kind of evidence to cover everything we need to teach and learn. There are things that kids need to learn. There are things that we need to teach for which we do not have absolute rock solid evidence. And even the best methods and programs don't work for everyone. Now, that particular bullet point, I've got it in here. I'm not going to take it out, but it scares the hell out of me. Not here because I think you're all of a right mind, but that bullet point scares me if I have people, I think in the audience, if I think I have people in the audience who really want to go back to balanced literacy, because they would say, that's right. Even the best methods and programs don't work for everyone. So I have to be ready to go back to teaching how I used to teach, because you just said the science of reading isn't going to work for everyone. So I need to be ready to go back. Saying the first choice in the science of reading doesn't work for everyone isn't saying that everything works for someone. Nothing works for everyone is not the same thing as saying that everything works for someone. You still want to choose things that have a reasonable foundation in the hard science. You still want to do things that make sense given what we know about the science. I sometimes use a metaphor about jigsaw puzzles. If you're putting a jigsaw puzzle together and you don't have the picture on the cover of the box and you're working it out, you're figuring it out, you're putting things in, and every part of the picture you've completed so far is yellow flowers. And there's a section down here that you haven't gotten to. Should you expect it to be yellow flowers, or should you expect it to be fire trucks? You know, you should go looking for other yellow flowers. You should go looking for things that are pieces of a puzzle that are similar to the pieces you've put together already. You should not go looking and say, well, this could be anything. This could be fire trucks. This could be mountains. So I'm going to start pulling in all these other puzzle pieces and see if they fit, see if they work. That's a very dangerous thing. And, you know, we should not do it. So that's why this one concerns me, is the confusion between the idea that even the best methods and programs don't work for everyone doesn't mean that every method and program works for someone. It's not a license to go do whatever the hell you want. So now we get to my bullseye. So I'm going to minimize some of your pictures here so I can see everything I wrote, because it's also damn smart. I need to read it. The strongest science is in the middle. That's the bullseye. Things should be taught explicitly. Phoneme awareness matters. Phonics matters. We should draw kids' attention to sounds and letters. We should integrate the teaching of reading with writing. We should integrate the teaching of reading with spelling. We should be able to do speech to print. We should be able to do synthetic phonics. These are things which I believe are in the middle of the bullseye. That's where they reside. They're extremely unlikely to be overturned by other science. They're rock solid, and that's where we want to start. There isn't enough in the bullseye to cover everything we need to teach or every child who needs to learn. We will step outside the bullseye. Not everything's going to be in the middle. This is where I start to get into some disagreement with some of the hardcore lab guys like Mark Seidenberg and some other people who teach us, who give us extraordinary amounts of science and understanding for which we always need to be grateful. But all that stuff's in the red. It's all in the bullseye. There isn't enough of that to solve every problem or fill every lesson for every person. But we should only step as far away as we need to. The closer you get to the bullseye, if you look at that first ring outside the bullseye in this model, that would be things that are consistent with the known science. They have more direct evidence of effectiveness, if not complete evidence. They are built on principles like explicit instruction, opportunities to practice, developmental readiness, coordinated instruction, that have strong scientific support, but in other ways, they may resemble other successful methods and programs that have scientific support, even if they don't have scientific support. Even if that part of the program hasn't clearly been established by science, they look like things that have been established by science. So we start in the red, we drift out as far as we need to, but no farther than we need to. We don't skip over things. We don't go choose ways of teaching that seem to violate what we see in the red. We don't go choose a way of teaching that has 7 outlying unanswered questions, as opposed to something that has only 1 or 2 questions. We don't choose a method of teaching reading which is remarkably different, dramatically different from other things we've done, based on different philosophies, based on different theories, maybe based on theories which have not held up, when we still have options that are closer to the bullseye. We don't run out to the edge of the target, or God forbid, off the target entirely. We try to never go off the target entirely. We don't go out to the edge of the target. We don't go out to the fringe science before we've exhausted things that are closer to the bullseye. We try to start in the middle and stay as close as we possibly can. Further from the bullseye, we have less direct scientific support. It kind of makes sense. It seems to be reasonable, but we don't have as much support as we would like. At the risk of putting my foot in the fire, or putting my head on the chopping block and opening up some wounds for people, the debate we've seen over the last couple of years about how to teach phonemic awareness, how far to go with it, how to advance phonemic awareness, whatever we're calling it these days. There's very good science that tells us there's certain things in phoneme awareness we need to teach. The science that says we should be teaching this advanced phoneme awareness is not as strong, but think about this. We found that phonics is important, and we found that teaching it explicitly is better than teaching it implicitly. We found that phonemic awareness is important, and we found that teaching it explicitly is better than teaching it implicitly. We know that vocabulary is important, and teaching it explicitly is better than relying entirely on implicit learning of vocabulary. So keeping that in mind, why should I expect that if advanced phoneme awareness is important, why should I expect that it will be the one thing that we should not teach explicitly? If it's important, if we see that kids who read well as a group have more advanced phonemic awareness, why should I guess that this will be the one thing that we should never teach explicitly, that teaching explicitly won't be helpful, and more importantly, won't be helpful to anyone, that it's a waste of time? To me, that seems unreasonable. One of the things I see in the science over and over again is that explicit is better than implicit. Teaching it intentionally and clearly is better than letting kids try to figure it out for themselves. I'm not saying that some kids don't figure it out for themselves. I'm saying for the kids who don't, you get to that point and they don't have it, why would I think that teaching it explicitly was a bad idea when teaching other things explicitly is routinely proved to be such a good idea? We want to look for things where multiple aspects of the approach, we want to be cautious about things where multiple aspects of the approach appear significantly different from programs and methods with stronger scientific support. Going back to the advanced phoneme awareness, I see people who I respect, and I'm open to what they're saying. I'm trying to understand their position, who say that phoneme awareness is good to teach, but you don't have to teach the advanced stuff because kids don't become readers because we teach them phoneme awareness. They learn that advanced phoneme awareness because they become readers. That's a little scary to me, because in my debate, in my ongoing war with the people of balanced literacy and whole language, I've heard them say on multiple occasions, face-to-face and in writing, kids don't learn to read by teaching them phonics, they learn phonics by reading. Kids don't learn phonemic awareness by teaching them phonemic awareness, they learn phonemic awareness by reading. It scares me to hear people say, yeah, you don't need to teach them that, they'll just figure it out on their own. What about the kids who don't figure it out on their own? Should we say that we're not going to teach it to them? That answer has never worked well, and I don't know why I would think it would work well now. What can we learn from other professions? They do this all the time. This is one of the things I want people to understand. Other professions face many of these same dilemmas constantly. And I'm going to give you some examples here that are easier for me to remember than you. So I'll go slow because you may not know what these things are. The example of fluvoxamine. So fluvoxamine is, I don't know that it's used anymore, but it's an antidepressant in the same class with Prozac and sertraline and Paxil and a bunch of other ones. They're called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The commercial name, the brand name of fluvoxamine was Luvox. People noticed when they first started prescribing these medicines 20, 30 years ago, people noticed that when they prescribed fluvoxamine, this was the first one they noticed it for the treatment of depression, people with depression who also had obsessive compulsive disorder did better. They thought they noticed that. They thought that was there. They didn't have any hard science about it, but through the folklore of medicine and prescribing, fluvoxamine became the antidepressant of choice for people who were depressed and also had some features of obsessive compulsive disorder. Later, so this would be considered kind of an off-label use or a folklore, some kind of medication folklore. Later, good studies showed that that was true, that Luvox really was effective, not just in the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorders, but it decreased anxiety generally. It was good also as an antidepressant. So it became the drug of choice for people who were both depressed and had some anxiety. But not everybody responded to fluvoxamine. So what do you do if they don't respond to fluvoxamine? Do you just keep prescribing fluvoxamine because it's in the bullseye? Do you just keep doing that, or do you come up with another idea? And if you come up with another idea, should it be to prescribe another medicine like Prozac or sertraline, that is closer to fluvoxamine, or should you prescribe some just random medication that's left over in your drawer? Pretty obviously, you should try to stay as close to fluvoxamine as you can. So people started, when it didn't work, they started prescribing other antidepressants in that same class. And sure enough, just like with depression, where one of the medicines works and another one doesn't for somebody, sometimes the other medicines work better for the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety than other medicines did. This was a reasonable decision. The thing that should be my first choice isn't working, and I'm making a rational, careful second choice. Valproate, it's an anti-seizure medication, better known as Depakote. People observed years ago that folks who took valproate also got some benefit in leveling out their mood. People who are more explosive once in a while, they may have evidence of mania, they may have evidence of bipolar depression. If we gave them, even if they didn't have seizures, if we gave them Depakote, many of them did better. So if you've exhausted other mood stabilizing medications and you tried Depakote, which was well documented to be helpful, although it started out as an off-label use, and Depakote doesn't work, what else might you try? You're running out of options. We need to do something. This person's life isn't going well. We need to help them with medication if that's at all possible. You should try other medicines, probably like valproate. Maybe you consider trying other anti-seizure medications because valproate isn't working, but maybe these others will. And sure enough, over time, we get Tegretol, we get Lamictal, now we see gabapentin, we see these other anti-seizure medications, which are used when valproate doesn't work, and one by one, we get evidence that those are also clinically effective. You don't say, well, valproate isn't working, but that's the only one that we know for sure has a chance of working, so I'm just going to keep giving it to you. I'm just going to keep doing what I was doing all along. And we don't say, well, valproate isn't working, so I'm just going to try some random medication. I'm going to give you a heart med, or I'm going to give you antibiotics. That doesn't make any sense. You want to choose something close to the proven thing, something which shares certain features with the proven thing, even if the thing you're choosing isn't proven. Now, the desperate example of ketamine, many of you may be aware that for otherwise very difficult to treat depression, there are studies going on that show the use of ketamine in different dosing schedules can be effective in treating otherwise impossible or very difficult to treat depression. That's an interesting finding, particularly because there's no obvious reason that ketamine should be effective. It's not like other medications we use for these conditions at all. And the studies are pretty thin, and there's not a lot of them yet. And the people who believe in ketamine have been experimenting with it for years in different doses, in spite of any clear, solid evidence that it's effective. The evidence is piling up now. But let me allow you all to play amateur psychiatrist right here. Would you give ketamine as your first choice for somebody with severe depression, or would you try other things first, knowing that you might resort to ketamine at the end if everything else didn't work? I hope all of you said we would try other things first, knowing that we might resort to ketamine at some point in the future. You know, we might start teaching reading a certain way, following a certain schedule, doing things a certain way, but when they don't work, we may need to go back and modify things. Not big modifications, small modifications, take them one at a time, but we're trying to stay as close to the bullseye as we can, while not simply giving up and saying, well, this is all I've got, there's nothing else I can do. Psychedelics, particularly naturally occurring psychedelics like psilocybin that occurs naturally in certain species of mushrooms, has been shown in certain conditions under certain dosing schedules to be highly effective for treating depression in certain populations of people, particularly in people who are depressed towards the end of their life because they have a fatal illness and it's troubling them, and that their fear and their depression about what's happening to them becomes overwhelming. That population of people seems to respond well, some of them, to psychedelic mushrooms to help them manage their depression and manage their fear of death in ways that other medications have failed to do for them. Now, there are people around the world who are trying to use psychedelics, mushrooms in particular, to treat depression, which is not related to terminal illnesses. Is that reasonable? It might be if everything else has failed. So I know a young woman in the Milwaukee area who I had contact with off and on, starting from the age of 15 or 16. This is kind of troubling, so I apologize to people, but she had some form of depression which was absolutely impervious to treatment. She was chronically suicidal. She was a very bright girl, explained herself very well, but felt absolutely compelled to take her own life, and she tried multiple times. Her mother was at her wit's end. We got this kid electroconvulsive therapy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but you try to get approval to do electroconvulsive therapy on a kid who's not 18 yet. They're only 17. But she was so depressed and so intent on killing herself. She had over 20 rounds of electroconvulsive therapy, didn't do a damn thing. Been hospitalized over and over again. Mother having to live on pins and needles every day that her daughter is going to try to kill herself again, knowing that this is coming. It's just a matter of time. For her, would it be reasonable for her to go someplace and, under the guidance of somebody who knows what they're doing, use psychedelics to try to treat her depression? I think so. I think so. Are psychedelics approved for the treatment of depression? No. Are they legal in most places? No. But our option otherwise is to do nothing. And that's not acceptable. So there's good reason to believe this. There is some evidence to believe in it. It's very different than what we were doing before, but you might get to that point. The challenge, of course, is understanding enough, whether you're teaching reading or doing anything else, to rank your options and moving away from the center cautiously. If you're in the bullseye and you're trying Prozac and sertraline and Lexapro and all these other antidepressants and they're not working, your next choice is not psychedelics. Your next choice are other approved medications. Your next choice is not ketamine. It's these other approved choices, and that's what you have to go with. More examples. I don't know how many of you have ever had occupational therapy or physical therapy. But physical therapy, I've had physical therapy a number of times for a bunch of different things. It's always been very, very helpful to me. everything I do in physical therapy has a valid scientific basis to it. But the last round of physical therapy I did, the scientifically demonstrated course of exercises that I was supposed to do, which are known to benefit my condition, were very easy for me to do. So my physical therapist, instead of having me do them that way, made them more challenging. She amped them up for me on the principle that I could maybe do better. This is based on principles of physical therapy that says exercises and physical therapy routines are more effective for people when they approach the limit of the person's ability. She didn't eliminate the exercises I was doing that I was supposed to do that were demonstrated by science to be effective. She modified them. She added some more. There were 7, I do 9. Other people were doing them a certain way. I was doing them in a more difficult way. Other people who were so injured or so ill that they couldn't do the physical therapy exercises as described in the literature. It's something called Big and Loud, if anybody wants to research it. People who couldn't do those because they were already too infirmed, either because of their illness or because of other physical limitations, a good physical therapist will modify the exercises to make them easier. Exercises that I might do standing or on one foot, they might do sitting. Is there evidence that that's the way that's going to be as beneficial to them? No, but there's evidence that the core exercise is effective, and we know the principles are, if they can't do it, it's not going to help them. So I have to modify the exercise and make it so that they can do it. I think that happens a lot in reading. We have in reading instruction, we have evidence that teaching a certain thing a certain way is beneficial to somebody, but another child just can't do it. So you modify it. You modify the difficulty of the task. You modify the intensity of the task. You modify how long we stay with this skill till we move on to the next skill, because those are reasonable things to do under those circumstances. We have to balance urgency and caution. We have to do something. What we're doing isn't working. I feel urgency to find something that will work, but we have to be cautious not to jump ship too early. I skipped over it, but I'm coming back to it. In psychotherapy, we have very good evidence that, and this is just one example, that an approach to therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy tends to be, in almost every study that looks at it, some version of cognitive behavioral therapy is almost always more effective than other forms of therapy. But that doesn't tell me exactly how to do that for every case that I see. It doesn't tell me what question to ask next. It doesn't tell me how to apply cognitive behavioral therapy to somebody who's locked in their room and won't come out. Those questions are not easily answered. There are no scientific answers to those questions. There are philosophical answers to those questions. So if I come to and this has happened a number of times to me in my career, if I come to a house because a mother has called for help because she said her son is talking about killing himself, he's gone into his room and he won't come out, and I go stand at his door and he's barricaded his door with furniture. So I can't get through the door. He's talking to me through the door, but he won't let me in. What do I do? There is no science that tells me what to do. There's science that tells me therapy, a cognitive behavioral approach is likely to be better, but he won't let me through his damn door, and I don't know what he's doing in there. Do I take the door off the hinges? I've done that. Do I take the locking mechanism on the door apart? I've done that. Do I break in? I've done that. Do I jimmy the lock with a credit card or a butter knife? I've done that. Do I go outside and try to come in through the window? I've done that. Do I walk away and tell mom, call me again when he's willing to talk? I've never done that. There's too much urgency to walk away. And I think when we have kids in first, second, third, fourth grade who are struggling to read, there's too much urgency to walk away. We can't just say, well, bring him back when he's doing better. I'm just going to keep doing the same thing I'm doing now, even though I'm not getting any results. We can't do that. That's immoral. It is immoral to keep doing things. Now, on the other hand, if you work with them using the most commonly used methods, the methods which are the most supported by science, and you work with them for a day and you say, well, this isn't working, I'm going to jump to something else. That's reckless. That's incautious. That's uncautious. You should take more time. You should consult with your friends. Should consult with your colleagues and say, you know, I'm doing this thing with this kid and it's not working, and I'm not sure whether I should try something else or whether I should keep doing it. Pick their brains, consult with people, consult with experts, consult with each other, consult with your fellow teachers, your fellow tutors, your fellow parents, to share your thinking with them so that they can give you feedback. We are not required to be right. This is going to sound strange to people. We are not required to be right in our choices. We are required to have right reasons for our choices that we can explain to other professionals. If you're teaching a child a certain way, because the other way of teaching them wasn't working, if you switched from program A to program B, even though program A ostensibly has more science behind it, I should be able to come to you and say, explain to me why you chose to switch to program B when you did. And you should be able to give me an answer that where I can understand your reasoning. I might not agree with you, but I can say, I can see how you got to that decision. If your best answer to that question is, I don't know, I felt like I had to do something. Why did you choose this? It was there, it was sitting on the table. I have a friend who likes it. That's not a good enough reason. You should have a clear reason why you did it, a reason you can make clear to other people. I take this principle from my own work, where if I evaluate somebody, which I've done thousands of times, a child or an adult who says they want to harm themselves, and somebody else says we should make them go to the hospital, and they say, I don't want to go to the hospital. I may have to make a decision about whether we're going to force them to go to the hospital against their will. And there's a lot of legal things in that decision. I am not required to make the so-called right decision. I am required to make my decision the right way. I should be able to explain why I'm making my decision. I should be able to name the people I consulted with and what they told me. And my reasoning after the fact should be transparent to other people about why we did it. If you're working, and this comes up, I think, the most when people modify programs and they're teaching kids to read. So they're teaching kids to read in a particular scope and sequence that's laid out for them. And for certain reasons, they decide to go slower or go faster or do things in a slightly different way in a slightly different order. I should be able to come to you and ask, tell me why you made those modifications. And you should say, because of this, this, and this. I might not make the same decision you did, but when you explain it to me, I should be able to say, oh, I see why you did that. I might have done something else, but I can see why you did it. That's behaving scientifically. Even if there isn't clear science to unambiguously declare that you did the right thing, there's a reason you did it, and the reason makes sense to other knowledgeable people, and they can understand why you made that decision. That's critically important. Why did you do that? This is why I did it. Oh, okay, I understand. Final thoughts. Be mindful of your own bias. I don't see all of you on the screen right now because that's not how I have my page set up, but everybody's biased. If I stand in front of a room full of people, I say, how many of you can fall victim to your own bias? Every hand should go up. Everybody's biased. We all like certain things just because we like them. We dislike certain things because we dislike them. One of the things I see online all the time, somebody describes a lesson or they hold up some curriculum materials that advise that after the kid uses phonics and letter sound knowledge to figure out the word, and they think they know what the word is, but they got it a little bit wrong. They mistook house for horse, and they read a sentence, he enjoyed riding his house. They advise asking a kid, now think about that, does that make sense? There are people on our side of the fence who lose their minds if they see something like that, because that sounds too much like whole language. But it's a very different thing than whole language. What makes sense, asking what makes sense after you've made a letter sound based attempt to decode the word is a good way of checking whether you got it right. And then if you realize you must have gotten it wrong, go back and use your letter sound knowledge to try it again. To go through and use all the letters and all the sounds to correct your mistake. So be mindful of your own bias. Be mindful that human beings are very biased creatures. There's nothing we can do to avoid that. You need to understand that about yourself. Know where the science ends and your best judgment begins. You know, there's a difference, again, between your best judgment about what to do with the science and what the science actually says. Don't love your ideas so much you wouldn't abandon them. Don't abandon the science. Don't abandon what the science tells you. But these gaps that you're filling in, be ready to abandon them. But don't be too quick or too slow to move further from the center. Don't be too quick or too slow to change what you do. This is a very difficult thing. Be willing to modify how you teach. Be willing to modify what you're doing. But don't be too quick to do it or too slow. And finding the balance of that for the kids you're working with is an enormous challenge. It's an enormous challenge. I would compare this to, I've got a kid in a room. He's barricaded the door. I'm going to go in there. Do I go to the drastic, do I make the drastic step to break through his door now? Do I wait a little longer? Do I give him more chances to let me in? You don't want to do that too soon. You also don't want to do it too late. You don't know what scientists know. We just have to accept that. Mark Seidenberg knows things about reading that we're just never going to know. He knows certain things about reading, but they don't know what you know either. Mark has never stood in front of a classroom of first and second grade students for a year to teach them reading and math and everything else, and trying to get them out onto the playground and into their winter jackets and back and forth to the lunchroom and back and forth to the bathroom and back and forth to everything they need to do. He's never done that. He doesn't know what you know about that, and those things matter. You don't know everything that he knows, but he doesn't know everything you know either. And I think he would admit that, and I think the other hardcore scientists would admit that as well. Your instincts, your experience, your creativity, your dedication are what breathe life into the science and give it the power to change lives. Without those things from you, the science just lays dormant on a table and never affects the way a kid is taught. You have to figure out a way to implement it. You have to know enough about the science to implement it reasonably and fairly and with respect for the science, but not so much respect for the science that you don't give life to what it is. Very frustrating to me. There was an awful thing going around on the internet about somebody who was criticizing the science of reading because it doesn't include motivation, and motivation is so important. And they give this made-up example of kids who lose motivation to learn to read because they're in the science of reading classroom. You know, besides the fact that they weren't describing motivation, they were describing engagement, which really pissed me off. This idea that the science of reading is supposed to answer every question. The science of reading is supposed to explain every detail of what we do. It should include worries about motivation. It should include answers to every question we have about classroom design and furniture and what time of the day. We don't have all that. We don't have all that. Motivation and engagement aren't unique to reading. Why should they be housed within the science of reading and not within the science of teaching, where they more rightfully belong? I thought that was a cheap attempt to disparage the science of reading by putting up a straw man argument. So that's the presentation. That's the bullseye. That's this idea I have. And the biggest thing I want people to know who teach kids to read is lots of people are doing lots of things. Physicians, surgeons, psychotherapists, physical therapists, dentists, occupational therapists, speech therapists. Lots of people are doing lots of things which are rooted in the science, but they don't have all the scientific answers to everything they want to do either. Neither do you. There's a way to do this. There's a responsible way to do this. There's a standard of care and a professional way to approach it that works for them and will work for you as well, I think. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Does anybody have any questions, any comments? I really want this to be, the biggest thing I want you to walk away from here is saying, I'm not doing too bad. I'm like those other people. I know something about the science of reading. And just remember this, if the science of reading comes out a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, and finds a definitively better way to teach phonics or to teach phonemic awareness, that doesn't mean that the way you taught it, and might still be teaching it, didn't work. It just means we've found something better now. Doesn't mean what you were doing was bad. It just means we found something better now. We find better things all the time. Doesn't mean that what we were doing before was bad. If you're doing whole language, that was bad. But I don't think any of you are doing whole language. We should spend less time feeling bad and more time teaching to the best of our abilities, understanding that in a week or a month or a year, you'll be even better at it. You might find yourself doing things differently, but you don't have to feel bad about the way you used to do it. That's true for everybody. You know, there was a point in time when everybody who had their gallbladder removed had it removed in an open procedure. They would cut a slit, they would cut an incision in your abdomen in a certain spot, they would open you up, they would get out your gallbladder, they'd sew you back up. Then people developed methods of doing that laparoscopically, which were much better. But there were still surgeons in the world who didn't know how to do it laparoscopically. They weren't trained in that. They didn't have the equipment to do it. While they were waiting to learn to do laparoscopic surgery, should they just not do open cholecystectomy? Should they not remove gallbladders the old way? It's not as good as laparoscopically, but it still works. And somebody's in front of me and they need their gallbladder removed. They should learn the new way of doing it. But until they do, the way they were doing before isn't evil. It isn't destructive. You can keep doing it until you know a better way.
Thank you, Steve. There really isn't anything in the chat. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, they're welcome to, but I know we're all kind of tired at this point in the evening.
Yeah, it's a long day, especially for those of you on the East Coast. You know, it's even later. It's 7:30 here. It's 8:30 where you are. You know, in Australia, it's tomorrow. So I don't know how they're doing that at all.
Paula just asked a question on the chat instead of typing it in. If you want the recording for this, we don't send the recordings out. We put them on our YouTube channel. So just look for the Reading League Wisconsin YouTube channel, and it'll be there probably tomorrow.
So if you come out of this feeling bad about something you do, then you haven't understood what I said. I want you to feel good about it. I want you to feel good about what you're doing. I want you to see yourself as a professional, like all these other professionals, as you try to do things better and get better at what you do without feeling bad about what you did.